Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DaCosta. Thank you for joining me today on my show called Consistent Preterism. I'm happy you could join me. Today we're going to be talking about some more random topics. I created some more meme teachings and I'm going to kind of work off of those to spur up a little thought and to get the old think tanks working. Today is actually Sunday. Those of you who listened to my audio yesterday know that I mentioned that I don't always share these audios when on the days that I record them. I kind of just record them whenever I get a free second and some privacy. And so today is Sunday, and I am recording this and plan to share it probably in a couple of days. But anyways, I woke up this morning to a text from a friend of mine who I've played basketball with for many years. And he asked me to if I was available to play in a men's league this morning because their team didn't have a couple guys and they were, needing a player or two. And so I said, so I'm thinking, hey, I have to go to church with my girlfriend. I agreed that I would do this. And the game was at 10 a.m. and church service starts at 11:15. So I'm like, oh man, I really want to play rather than go pretend to be a wannabe Israelite. Rather than go pretend to be an Israelite. But so I did the right thing. I approached my girl very tenderly and very cautiously, and I said, honey, would you mind if I skipped church today and went to play in a basketball game? The guys are really stuck and they need me. And I'm in another men's league on Thursday nights, so I do have other stuff going on, but I just kind of wanted to play. I like playing in new leagues to see the talent and see what's going on. And so I told her, I said, I would like to play, and, what do you think about that? And so she was already not feeling too well, so she was like, that's fine, go for it. So I actually played this morning, and I played really well, and I think I had to have hit at least 9 or 10 3-pointers. I've been playing basketball all my life, and I've always been a shooter, deep threat. So, when you're a shooter, you kind of can remember how many threes you hit based on the areas that you hit them and per half. And I don't really keep track of my points, but I base my points off of how many threes I hit. Because usually if I hit 8, 9, 10 threes in a game and I have a couple twos on the side of that with a couple free throws, usually in the 30 to 35 point range. And today was good. So I played really well. We won the game. And then obviously these guys are now like, all right, well, why don't you run with us the rest of the season? And so I'm like, oh boy, that's going to be tough. I told her that it would only be a one-time thing. So I basically told them, I said, I can do this as long as you guys make the games early. So they have 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 o'clock games on Sundays. I said, if you can lock us in for 8 a.m. and 9 a.m., on these Sundays, I can definitely play, because after that, at 11:15, I have to pretend to be an Israelite. So they said, yeah, we can definitely probably do that. So we'll see. Hopefully I can jump on and continue playing with them. Got a pretty decent team. Couple big guys and a couple small guys. But so that was fun. I love basketball. It's always been a passion of mine. But enough about me and my basketball antics. Today I want to talk about a few random things and then get into a few meme teachings. For those of you who listened to my audio that I shared yesterday, see how I did that? I'm assuming that I'm going to share this on Tuesday, but I know I already have one done to share Monday, so I'm going all kind of forward on you and kind of confusing myself, but hopefully you guys understand. Anyways, for those of you who listened to the audio that I shared on my channel yesterday, you remember me talking about a guy that goes by the YouTube name Daily Dump, and how he came on and he commented on my nail in the coffin video audio, and basically came on with some of the same arguments that I usually get. And it seemed like he was just starting to listen to my audios when he started to argue with me a little bit. And so I came back in frustration, as I normally do, when I hear the same old arguments repeated to me. And it didn't go very well in the beginning, but I ended up going to bed that night. This was, I think it might have been Friday night. But anyways, I went to bed that night, and I told him, I said, I'll wake up and I'll check your comments, and we'll go at it again if you need to, And so I woke up, and he had posted a link on the comments in that nail in the coffin video. And so I went and listened to that link, and wouldn't you know it, he must have listened to a couple more of my audios throughout the night, because he posted a 10-minute link of, he recorded himself speaking, and it's titled "The End of Preterism" with a question mark. And I don't know who the guy is. I don't recognize his voice. I have never really heard of him before, but he basically in the 10-minute audio admitted that he sees my points and he understands where I'm coming from, and it makes a lot of sense. And, you know, logically, in terms of being consistent, it makes no sense to say that everything happened, and the resurrection, the judgment, the saints inherited the kingdom, all that happened 2,000 years behind us, and the salvation of the elect was fully completed, but then there's more salvation going on after that. He admitted fully that it makes no sense, and that the things that I present are pretty solid. So I was pretty encouraged by that, because, you know, just, 8 hours prior to that, he was arguing with me and you know, not really understanding my points fully. But then when he took the time, I guess, to kind of slow down and listen to what I was saying, he ended up coming around to see it. So who knows where that'll go. But I did want to, you know, take the time to acknowledge that, because I did mention his arguments on yesterday's audio. And I think he really started to see where I was coming from. And I appreciate that. Like I always say, you know, if you and I have had bad blood in the past, and you've argued with me, you've called me names, I've called you names, whatever the case may be, I'm always going to forgive, and I'm always going to be gracious with those who are honest and humble. And it's not that I have all the answers. Trust me, I'm still working this story out just like the rest of you. But I think that it takes real humility and character to admit that somebody has a stronger argument than you, and admit that there's no real way you can get around those arguments. That takes humility, and not a lot of people are willing to do it. So, you know, I appreciate anybody who admits that an argument is better, because I've done it. I mean, I've been studying the Bible now for maybe 7 years, and I've progressed through views because the evidence has been better for the next one. You know, and you shouldn't stay in one view just because it's where you're at and it's where you're comfortable. You should progress where the evidence leads, and that is what I feel I've done. And I have no motive. One idiot on another comment from one of my audios way back says that I have motive and I'm trying to sell books for gain and blah, blah, blah. And it's just incredible how stupid these people can be. It's like, no, I'm not trying to sell books for gain. He basically accused me of writing my first book, The Kingdom of Christ, because I wanted to make money. But all along, I knew that I was Israel only, which is laughable, really. I mean, who's going to invest months of their time, weeks of energy on typing a document out, weeks of energy on editing a document, hundreds of dollars of my own money to purchase a stock of books, to then go out and take time and energy to resell those books, and just go through that whole process, which is very time consuming and very demanding. As any of you know who have written books or long documents, you know, it's not easy. So, you know, his accusation that I did that all while being secretly I.O. is laughable. All right. And it just goes hand in hand with his lack of intelligence in the Bible. He's just an idiot. So of course, his idiocy is going to, you know, come through on other areas of his life. And that's exactly what's happening here. You know, with Christians, it's kind of tough because they always think you're out to, you know, turn them away from the faith. They always think you're out to get them, to deceive them. They always look at you as kind of like a antichrist, you know, trying to shipwreck their faith. So you really can't have intelligent conversations with many of them, unfortunately. They always have their guard up. They always feel like, for instance, futurists will always quote Revelation where John says, whoever changes a word in this book will be cursed or cut off or whatever. And it's funny because futurists actually quote that, but I'm like kind of like scratching my head like, how are you going to change a word in that book? Because that book is penciled in and it's it's in the Bible. You're never going to change anything there. So, you know, they look at people who come out with a different interpretation as sort of the Antichrist and the enemy, and they really don't give it a fair chance, which is unfortunate. But there are some who do. And I feel like a lot of them are in the full preterist camp because full preterism was such a radical shift in their paradigm that they're more open to something like Israel only, or what I call consistent preterism, because they've already made a radical leap from futurism to full preterism. So they're probably thinking, you know what, if all these events already took place 2,000 years behind us, then I might as well listen to the arguments here, because it could be, it very well could be. And I always say, look at the futurists. When we were futurists, we looked at the end of the age, the resurrection, the judgment, the inheritance of the new heaven, new earth. We looked at all of that as the end. There was nothing beyond that. It was the end, because we were looking at the Bible for what it said, and it was very clear to us that salvation ended when those events occurred. So now, as full preterists, what we've done is we've recognized that everything already took place, but we've sort of got nervous a little bit, and the leaders of full preterism, who really laid the groundwork for this movement, over the last 5 to 10 decades, however long it's been, they've sort of adjusted their view to somehow include us in a salvation narrative after all the inheritance of those promises took place. So it just really just goes against everything logical. And I think that's why people are seeing it, and they're admitting that the arguments are pretty ironclad and you can't get around them. So, so just wanted to give a shout out to Daily Dump. I don't know if he's going to put out more audios or whatever, but I appreciated his honesty there. In other news, Dr. Wayne Critchfield put out a quick 6-minute rant today, and again, there was literally no scripture in it, no exegesis, just him sitting in his garage talking about school buses and cheeseburgers and all kinds of wacky stuff. It's entertaining. Trust me, I love it. I listen to his rants just because I like to chuckle. But in terms of actually exegeting the scriptures, he does very little of that. He'll teach for 1 minute, he'll talk for 8 on unrelated stuff, and then he'll tell you that you just learned more in that 8 minutes than you would in a year of attending a futurist church. So he's kind of funny. But today he gave Michael Bradley and myself the nickname the Suicide Twins, which I thought was pretty cool. I kind of like it. It's got a catchy kind of ring to it. So the Suicide Twins, which I don't understand what he's getting at. But anyways, so we are the Suicide Twins now. Also, if you listen to yesterday's audio, which I titled Sola Scriptura, or Experimental Christianity, or Experiential Christianity, basically what you saw there is that people are realizing that scripturally they cannot defeat the covenant-only, Israel-only viewpoint. So what they're doing is they're kind of now relying on experiences, all right, more than anything. So experiences with a divine being, experiences with God. They're relying on emotions and feelings and things that they've experienced, and goosebumps that they've gotten certain spots in life, and God maybe delivering them out of some sort of turmoil and trouble that they were in, or whatever the case may be. But they're basing their faith now on experiences rather than the scripture, which is funny to me, because it was always scripture alone and scripture over everything, and now that's changing, and they're realizing that they can't go to the scriptures, so they're going to experiences. And like I told a friend of mine, I said, what all that really is then, if people are going to rely on experiences to say that their faith is accurate and what they believe is accurate, then their faith is no different than any other religion, right? I mean, think about it. You got Buddhists who claim they all have spiritual experiences as well. You got Hindus, you got Muslims, heck, even the pot-smoking, tree-hugging hippie up the way. She says she has spiritual experiences as well, and who's going to doubt her, right? It could be the drugs, or it could be a real divine being. But my point is that if you're unable to prove it from the Bible, the book that you base your entire faith on, and if you're just going by experiences alone, then your faith and your belief is no different than anyone else's. Because all of these religions have spiritual experiences. They all rely on things that they believe God has delivered them from. They all rely on a spiritual being or beings blessing them, watching over them, looking over them. They all have that common factor involved. So really, yours is no different than theirs, which takes us back to the point that this is basically open. I don't see any form of religion as being valid. I just see God as being sort of an open book where anyone can come to whoever he is and experience, I don't know, love or compassion, whatever it is. So again, if you're relying solely on experiences, which it seems like many people are doing, then your religion and your faith is no different than the other religions who also have similar experiences to rely on. Like the Muslims who claim they see and hear Allah. I mean, what's the difference? It's really no different. There's tons of examples of this stuff. And no, I'm not a Muslim, so don't you dare try to use that against me, you trolls out there who are listening to this secretly while knowing that it makes tons of sense, but angrily sitting in your cognitive dissonance. So I think that's all I'm going to talk about as far as irrelevant crap today. I'm going to go into maybe a half dozen or so meme teachings, and I just want to point out a few things. So the first one I wanted to point out is this whole argument that God does not change. Okay, the angry wannabes out there when they hear that salvation has ended and that salvation was to go to all nations before the end came for the purpose of gathering the elect, the lost sheep of Israel. They get angry, and the argument that you sometimes come against is this one. It says this: God does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God does not change, damn it. Your view has God changing. Your view has salvation ending, so that means God changed. And this is just a real stupid argument from the get-go, because there's many issues with it, but the main one is that they're not realizing what the beginning and the middle and most of the Bible, 90% of the Bible, the whole Old Testament, they're not realizing what's back there and what that actually says. So you have 90% of the Bible in the Old Testament, you have 10% of it in the New, which is the last days of Israel, and they're basing their argument on twisted and misapplied scriptures in the New Testament, rather than going to the Old Testament and realizing that if they just looked back there and studied that a bit better, they would see that they're right. God does not change. So that means that I am right, not them. All right, so I'll demonstrate that from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 to 8. It says this: Moses, speaking to Israel, says, "For you, Israel, are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you, Israel, to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, Israel. For you were the least of all the peoples. But because the Lord loves you, Israel, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, Israel, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." All right, so that's just an amazing statement. And in that one portion, you can eliminate and annihilate all these arguments that God doesn't change and God doesn't respect people, blah, blah, blah. So first of all, Moses tells Israel they're a holy people. The Lord God chose them for himself as a special treasure, quote, above all the peoples on the face of the earth. He tells them that the Lord didn't set his love on them because they were more in number, because they were least in number, actually. And he says, but because the Lord loves you and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, the Lord has brought them out and redeemed them from Egypt. Now, when we go back to the promise given to Abraham, okay, that his descendants would become as the stars of heaven in multitude, we have to remember that these wannabes take that spiritually. They apply that spiritually. They say that has nothing to do with literal bodily descendants that descended from Israel. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about spirituality. It's all about faith, and Eskimos can have faith, and Indians can have faith, and Americans can have faith, and Greeks can have faith, and all nations, all peoples everywhere can have faith. But really, as I've been showing lately, heavily, and right here, again, perfect demonstration of it, the concept of Abraham's descendants was nothing other than Israel. Because look, he says, because the Lord loves you and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers. Okay, so what oath is that? Well, remember, who's the father? He's referring back to the promise that was made to Abraham that his descendants would become as the stars of heaven in multitude, and he would bless them. All right, so he's keeping the promise which he swore to Abraham. And he's speaking to Israel, telling them that because of that promise that God made to your fathers, literal Israelites, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you. There's that concept of redemption from the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So all throughout this story, God redeemed Israel over and over again. He redeemed them there when he brought them out of Egypt. He redeemed them in Jeremiah chapter 50 when he brought them back from the hand of the Chaldeans, when he gathered them from the nations and brought them back to the literal land. So this concept of God redeeming Israel is all over the pages of Scripture. People are just unaware. All right, but God redeemed Israel many times in the Scriptures. So when we come to the last days and we hear the redemption and reconciliation language, it is no different. It's also and again Israel. All right, but back to the main point here. If God doesn't change, like these bozos say, then this demands that those whom he loved in those last days were indeed the lost sheep of the house of Israel, just as Jesus said. All right, again, my view has God staying the same. He was always in love with his sheep. He always held them higher than all peoples. He always chose them higher than all peoples. Your view, wannabe Israelite, actually has God changing. God started off loving Israel higher than all peoples, telling them repeatedly over and over and over again that they were a chosen treasure, a vessel, inheritance, a prized portion, a special jewel that he chose above all peoples. And then all of a sudden, God changes that in the New Testament, and now all peoples are chosen and special and equal and everything. It just makes no sense. If God doesn't change, then my view is correct. And you're just misunderstanding the concept of Gentiles being converted in the nations. A Gentile is simply just a non-Jew. It's a person who is not practicing Judaism. And that could be anyone. It could be an Italian. It could be a Greek. By golly, it could be a Hebrew. Okay, so if it was a Hebrew in the nations who was not practicing Judaism, guess what they would have been referred to as by Jews? Gentiles. Okay, but again, and just to kind of pull your mind on this a little bit, when it says, when Jesus said in Matthew 15 that he comes only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, we have to really ask ourselves, why would he say that? Right? And then in another place he says, I was not sent but, he says, go nowhere but the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So why would Jesus be making these statements? Those are pretty bold statements, wouldn't you say? If this gospel was to go to everybody, all people for all time, why would Jesus have to make that statement? Why is it even in the Bible to begin with? Why did it come out of his mouth? It had to come out of his mouth for a reason, right? I come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Why did that happen? And I'm not even sure how full preterists explain that away, or futurists for that matter. I think what they do is they say, well, his main goal was Israel, but there's other side dishes. Israel was the filet mignon, and then the other people and the Gentiles and the nations are your baked potato, your asparagus, your creamed corn. So you got this main entree, and then you got these side dishes being served up on the side, which are all these other nations. But that's nonsense. Come on. Jesus said he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And all the evidence shows that the promises and everything was only for them. So, again, if someone's busting your chops about this, just come at them with Matthew 15:24 and say, hey, look, Jesus said I only come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Explain that to me. I want you to take the time to explain to me why he would say that. And then when they say, well, he said that, but, all of a sudden, when the woman came and showed her faith, everything changed and God opened it up for the Gentiles. Then you can hit them with their argument, but God doesn't change, right? God doesn't change. God's will was the same in this whole story. And John 6 shows exactly what God's will was. It was that every one of his elect would be raised on the last day and he would lose not one. That's God's will. And that all came to pass. The next one I want to read, it says, so again, you say that this is another one about Abraham's descendants, because people just, if you eliminate the Abraham's descendants argument to mean spiritual, you basically eliminate their whole foundation crumbles. They have nothing after you eliminate this. So what I've been doing is finding all the passages in Deuteronomy, Exodus, everywhere, that shows that Abraham's descendants were literally the children of Israel. That's what this focus is on. It's not on anybody but them. Okay, it has nothing to do with spiritual descendants by faith. Did you notice that? So nobody else in this story, all throughout the Old Testament, no foreign nations are ever referred to as Abraham's descendants. Do you realize how powerful that is? You have the 90% of the Bible. You have no foreign nations referred to as Abraham's seed or Abraham's descendants. Only Israel is ever referred to as Abraham's seed and Abraham's descendants. Then suddenly, when you get to the New Testament, these wannabes want to change that and say that all of a sudden the term Abraham's seed and Abraham's descendants refers to spiritual by faith. It's a spiritual descending by faith. But that was never the case in 90% of the Bible. Never the case in all of Israel's history. No foreigners were ever referred to as it. So did God change? Did all of a sudden the term and the concept of Abraham's seed and Abraham's descendants, did that change suddenly and become spiritual in the New Testament? Did God say, to hell with everybody prior to Christ, right? Everybody who was not an Israelite who lived prior to Christ can go kick rocks because I didn't care about them. But Christ and forward, if you're a Gentile, now you can be Abraham's seed by faith. No, that's ridiculous. The concept of Abraham's seed stays the same throughout. And like Paul told the Galatians, those foreigners in Galatia, right? They're foreigners, right? But what did he tell them? He said, if you're Christ's, Galatian, then that proves that you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise that was made to Abraham. Very easy, very clear. All right, so again, people say that the promise given to Abraham was to multiply his descendants like the stars of the heavens, and that this had absolutely nothing to do with his literal descendants, Israel, but everything to do with being a spiritual descendant by faith from all nations. But that's very interesting because, again, when Moses is speaking exclusively to the people of Israel in Deuteronomy 7, he refers back to that promise made to Abraham to multiply his descendants, and he links that promise exclusively to the people of Israel. This is what he says. Moses, speaking to Israel, says this in Deuteronomy 7:12. Then it shall come to pass, because you listen to these judgments and keep and do them, that the Lord your God will keep with you the covenant and the mercy which he swore to your fathers. And he will love you and bless you and multiply you. Okay, so God promised Abraham to multiply his descendants. Here's Moses telling Israel that because of that promise, God will love you and bless you and multiply you. But he's speaking only to Israel. He's not speaking to anyone else. I'm still desperately waiting and searching for a passage that tells us that the concept of being a descendant of Abraham suddenly changes from Israelites to spiritual people of all nations. There is none. There is none. People are taking the no distinction language by Paul, right, in the New Testament, and they're totally screwing it up. They're pulling it right out of its context. Paul was constantly trying to break down the barriers, to break down the walls between Jew and Gentile. The elect Jew, who was a practicing Israelite, a law-practicing Israelite, and the elect Gentile, who was a non-law practicing Israelite. Paul tells them there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile because he's speaking to a Jew or he's speaking to a Gentile and telling them that they're being gathered back into the body of Christ together as one. There's no distinction. What God has cleansed, let no man call unclean. Right? So, again, people botch the New Testament concept of no distinction. They see it as a broad, all-encompassing, all-nation-encompassing sort of concept, when in actuality, that no distinction was limited to the context of Israel as a whole. But Israel as a whole included both Jew and Gentiles. So there was no distinction between Jew and Gentile if you were Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. The next one we want to talk about, here's a good one that I always get. In fact, I got this one from Preston a few times and I kind of chuckled. Confused wannabes say God is no respect. Hold on, I got to do it in my voice. Hold on, ready? Let me hone in here. God is no respecter of persons. Your view makes God a respecter of Israel. It makes him favor Israel above other people. This is unbiblical. Okay, so that's the confused wannabe arguing that God is not a respecter of persons. In my view, the Israel-only covenant only makes God a respecter of Israel. But again, all of you who know the Bible know where this is headed. It's basically them heading straight towards a brick wall at 100 miles an hour and going to be splattered. All right, so look what Moses says in Deuteronomy 7, verses 13 to 16, speaking to Israel. He says, he will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your land, your grain and your new wine and your oil, the increase of your cattle and the offspring of your flock, in the land of which he swore to your fathers to give you. You shall be blessed above all peoples. There shall not be a male or female barren among you or among your livestock. And the Lord will take away from you all sickness and will afflict you with none of the terrible diseases of Egypt which you have known. Ready? But will lay them on all those who hate you. Also, you shall destroy all the peoples whom the Lord your God delivers to you. Your eyes shall have no pity on them, nor shall you serve their gods, for that will be a snare to you. So, come again, O confused wannabe. God is not a respecter of persons. God isn't a favorer of Israel. Are you absolutely out of your gourd? Everything that the Bible says shows that he is a respecter of persons. All right, again, this is coming from a misunderstanding of what Paul is doing. A misunderstanding of Paul's mission to sort of break down and gather in those who were near and those who were far off, of all different races, but again, not outside of the scope of Israel as a whole, the seed of Abraham. But look at this passage when Moses tells the Israelites, he says, you'll be blessed above all peoples. Is that favor? Is that respecting Israel more than other peoples? It sure is. He says he'll take from them all sickness and disease and will lay it on all peoples who hate you. Is that favor? Is that God loving Israel more than the other peoples? It sure is. And I just read you another passage from Deuteronomy that flat out says it. He chose them above all peoples, and he loved them more than all peoples because of the promise that he made to their father, Abraham. All right, the next one says, has anyone found any proof that the Israelites were to be a light to other nations? Or that God didn't favor them highly above all peoples? Because so far, all I see is quite the opposite. This is from Deuteronomy 7, just shortly after the one I just read you, verses 17 forward, says this. If you, Israel, should say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember well what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. The great trials which your eyes have seen, the signs and the wonders, the mighty hand and the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So shall the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. Moreover, the Lord your God will send the hornet among them until those who are left, who hide themselves from you, are destroyed. You shall not be terrified of them, for the Lord your God, the great and awesome God, is among you. And the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you, little by little. You will be unable to destroy them at once, lest the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. But the Lord your God will deliver them over to you, and will inflict defeat upon them until they are destroyed. And he will deliver their kings into your hand, and you will destroy their name from under heaven. No one shall be able to stand against you, Israel, until you have destroyed them. So again, where is the light going to the nations? Why is God destroying nations? Right? The sovereign God, the God of all flesh. Come on. Why isn't he using Israel and causing them to be gracious and merciful to these other nations, like people think the gospel is doing today? So the old covenant, God's causing nations to be slaughtered by the boatload for his people Israel. He's driving them out. He's beating them to the ground with sledgehammers. He's slaughtering man, woman, and infant, all for the sake of Israel. That's the old covenant. But in the new and better covenant, it seems like quite the opposite is happening today. So-called Christians are impoverished. They have no food. In Africa, they have no water. They have no shelter. The corporation called Compassion is begging people in America to sponsor all these Christians out in these nations because they have nothing. I get letters every week asking me to sponsor more kids because there's so many kids that have nothing, no food, no water, nothing. Then you have the Christians in North Korea and all the Islamic areas that are being slaughtered and their necks are being slit. So what's going on here? God drove out nations, destroyed nations, all for the sake of his people, all throughout that old covenant. But in the new and better covenant, people can't even get things to eat. And remember, those old covenant Israelites struggled with idolatry. They weren't as devoted to God as Christians are devoted to him today. Christians today won't even hear a reasonable argument. They shut it right down. Nope, Jesus is this, Jesus is that, Yahweh this, Yahweh that. I rebuke you in the name of the Lord. Right? You can't even get a word in edgewise with these buffoons. But it makes no sense because they're so committed, yet they're under so much strife and so much hostility and everything. It's really just does not make any sense. This is supposed to be a better covenant. And they'll shun that away by saying, no, it's spiritual. None of this matters on earth. We're just waiting to get where we're going. I mean, come on, really? It seemed to really matter to God in the old covenant. Look at this. He says, in that last one I showed you from Deuteronomy 7. Hold on, let me see. I just had it. Right here, he says, he will also bless the fruit of your womb, Israel, the fruit of your land, your grain, your new wine, your oil, the increase of your cattle, the offspring of your flock, in the land which he swore to your fathers. You will be blessed above all peoples. There will not be a male or female barren among you or among your livestock. He will take away all sickness from you and will not afflict you with any diseases that you have seen in Egypt. But he will lay those diseases on all. What the hell's going on? Right? What is going on? No diseases for the old covenant people, yet today diseases are running rampant within Christianity. How many Christians do you know that die of cancer? What's going on? These people are dedicated, devoted believers in Yahweh, and there's no protection for them on earth. But yet all throughout the old covenant, all that God talked about was blessing them, giving them fruit, giving them grain, giving them houses, giving them protection, taking away their sickness, being there for them. Something is just not right. And I think you know what it is. This story has nothing to do with anybody today. If it did, you'd see a lot different result in this better new covenant. God wouldn't just... See, again, God's changing. These people say God doesn't change. So, okay, then in the old covenant, he cared about the earthly, physical lives of his chosen people. But in the new covenant, he changes, and now he could give two shits. All right? He doesn't care about the earthly things of most of his people. Some of his people he does. The Hillsong churches, they must be doing something right. They're blowing up. Justin Bieber's pastor lives in an $8 million home, I think. Joel Osteen has a private jet. I mean, these people are living the life. They're blessed above all people. They must be the only ones in the new covenant. The next one I wrote says this. Oh, this one's good. Are you ready for this? So whenever someone argues with you that God shows that he is going to judge people because he judged nations in the Old Testament, this is the one you want to hit them with. Okay, because obviously they're not understanding that Israel was always involved in those judgments and that they were the apple of his eye and that whoever messed with them would get the wrath of God. And oftentimes, if not all times, whenever some nation or some area or some city fell, it had to do with the righteous that were there, like Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, or all these nations like Nineveh being warned to stop their wickedness because, of course, there were Israelites there and all this stuff. So God warns them because Israel's the apple of his eye. Remember the promise given to Abraham that he would bless those who blessed them and he would curse those who cursed them. So this all stems from that promise. But check this out. Get a pen. Write this down because you're going to want to... This one passage just defeats everything. All right, so Moses warns the children of Israel that they were to be careful and to observe the law and worship Yahweh alone. Moses tells them that if they didn't do this and if they failed in doing this, that they would perish. But notice how Moses words it here. This is Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 18 to 20. Deuteronomy 8, verses 18 to 20. He says this to Israel, "And you shall remember the Lord your God, Israel, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you, Israel, by any means forget the Lord your God, and follow after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day, Israel, that you shall surely perish." Ready? "As the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God." Now, Moses tells the Israelites that just like the nations that the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish. The key there is before you. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean like in chronological order. It doesn't mean that God destroyed these nations before he created Israel. No, it has nothing to do with that. Let's look at the Young's literal translation of that single passage and how it's worded. Ready? This is how it's worded. "Just as the nations whom Jehovah is destroying from your presence, so ye shall perish." Okay, so what does this show clearly? Well, again, it shows that what I've been saying all along is correct. It shows that all the times that God judged and destroyed other nations in this story, he did so for the sake of the apple of his eye, Israel. Just as the nations whom God is destroying from your presence, so he shall do with you, Israel. In other words, just as the nations that God is wiping out for your sake, Israel, if you don't observe this law, if you do not abide by his commandments, you will also perish. Do you see how that works? Very clearly. Make sure you shove that right down the throats of all these bozos. Okay? And there's countless other passages that say this. You can look in Jeremiah, you can look in Ezekiel when it talks about the nation judgments, and you can see that the point of all these nation judgments always had to do with Israel being there. It was how these nations treated the Israelites. In return, God was going to give them the wrath. All right, and that again goes back to the promise to Abraham. Bless those who bless thee, and curse those who curse thee. Here's another one, and the last one. It says in Deuteronomy 9:13 and forward, Moses is speaking about the rebellion and stubbornness of the people Israel, despite everything that God did for them and showed them. He says the following things about them. So these are just things that you can find in Deuteronomy 9, verse 13 and forward, all about Israel. Moses says these things. He says they are a stubborn people. They worshipped the golden calf. They turned aside from the way that the Lord had commanded them. They did evil in the sight of the Lord and provoked him to anger. They provoked the Lord to wrath again. They rebelled against the Lord's commandments. They did not obey the voice of their Lord. They have been a rebellious people from the start. Now, the Old Testament as a whole is chock full and overflowing with these statements about Israel's blatant rebellion and disobedience to their God, despite his glorious revelations to them and his protecting and providing for them. But how perfectly does this match what Paul said in Romans 1? Paul said this, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but instead became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things." So, who would be able to change the glory of Yahweh into an image? Only Israel. Okay? Who knew God, but even though they knew God, they didn't glorify him? Only Israel. Who saw all these glorious things, experienced the coming out of Egypt, experience everything that God did for them to protect them and bring them out of that bondage, and still didn't glorify him. And so they were without excuse. Only Israel. This doesn't work in any other context at all. It's got to be Israel. Okay? Has to be. And of course, we know Paul is writing to the Romans in Romans 4:1, and he says, "What did Abraham, our father, find according to the law?" So of course, he's writing to Israelites. All right, and he's basically going through a rundown of the history of the people as they were looking and longing for the coming of the Lord and the end of the age, where the kingdom would be restored to Israel in a new kingdom not made with hands. The kingdom would be delivered to God as a possession. That's what this was always about. Israel is always called an inheritance for God. God inherited them at the end. But anyways, I think that's all I got for today, folks. I hope you all enjoyed that one, and I hope this gave you some more ammo to use against the dishonest and completely illogical wannabe Israelite clan. Hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll be back another time, another place, another day, another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.